A 16-year-old boy walked out of his grandmother's home on a sunny afternoon in Fort Lauderdale and was never seen again. Witnesses claimed he was forced into a car, but no evidence was ever found. 4 decades later, the question still haunts his family and his city. What really happened to Maurice "Red" Jefferson? The Florida sun had just begun to sink behind rows of palm trees, casting long golden shadows across Fort Lauderdale. It was November 30th, 1983, an ordinary Wednesday by all appearances. But within hours, that day would etch itself into memory as the moment a promising young life simply vanished. Neighbors later recalled seeing a tall, skinny teenager walking briskly down Northwest 30th Terrace. He was hard to miss, bow-legged, his curly hair carrying a coppery glow that shifted to orange when the heat pressed heavy on the streets. Some waved as he passed. Others remembered thinking he seemed excited, as if racing toward a familiar routine. His name was Maurice Jefferson, though almost everyone in the neighborhood called him by his nickname, Red. At just 16 years old, Red embodied everything bright about youth: a choir boy at Piney Grove First Baptist Church, a junior varsity basketball player at Dillard High, a cadet in Junior ROTC with ambitions of wearing a white coat someday. His dream was to become a doctor. To his grandmother, he was the boy who left his wallet and ID on the dresser that afternoon, promising he'd be back after practice. But he never came home. By evening, when the streets cooled and porch lights flickered on, the questions began. Teammates gathered at the high school gym asked, "Where's Red? He should have been here an hour ago." His grandmother called neighbors, her voice trembling with worry. The night deepened, but the door never opened. The phone never rang. What began as confusion quickly hardened into dread. Some of the last reported sightings placed him at Franklin Park's basketball courts. That was where his trail seemed to dissolve into thin air. 2 teenage girls would later insist they saw him being forced into an Oldsmobile by 2 men they couldn't identify. Their account was haunting, yet unconfirmed. Without evidence, it remained suspended between truth and rumor. Meanwhile, the wider community was gripped by disbelief. Coaches remembered his energy, his smile lighting up practices. Church members recalled the strength of his voice, echoing through hymns. Friends whispered their own theories. Had he run away? Had something darker happened? But one fact silenced speculation. Maurice Jefferson never returned to his grandmother's house, never made another phone call, never touched the wallet and money left behind in his room. That November day ended like any other, with the city settling into its night rhythm. Families eating dinner, radios humming, televisions glowing. Yet in one home on Northwest 30th Terrace, a grandmother sat by the window staring into the street, waiting for footsteps that would never come. This was not just the story of a missing teenager. It was the unraveling of a family's hope, the ignition of a mystery that still burns more than 4 decades later. What happened in the gap between Franklin Park and Dillard High School? Who were the men in the Oldsmobile? And why did the search begin only when it was already too late? The disappearance of Maurice "Red" Jefferson is a story without an ending. But to begin understanding the weight of his absence, one must return to that single day in 1983, the day the sun set over Fort Lauderdale, and a boy with dreams of healing others slipped into the shadows of history. To those who knew him, Maurice Jefferson was never just another teenager lost in the crowd of Fort Lauderdale. He stood out, and not merely because of his striking hair, thick, curly, and tinted a shade of red so unusual for an African-American boy that friends gave him the nickname Red. In the sweltering Florida summers, when the heat rose from the pavement and the air shimmered like glass, that hair would shift to a fiery orange, catching the light as though it carried a spark of its own. But his appearance was only part of what made him unforgettable. At 6 feet tall but weighing barely 120 pounds, he looked lanky, almost fragile, until he stepped onto the basketball court. There, his long frame turned into an advantage. Coaches remembered his speed, the way he seemed to glide, his bow-legged gait giving him a unique rhythm. Teammates laughed about how they could always spot Red from a distance, not just because of his hair, but because of that unmistakable walk. At home, his grandmother would smile at his energy. Red had a tendency to leave things scattered, his wallet, his money, even his school papers, because he was always in a rush to get to the next thing. Basketball practice, church choir, Junior ROTC drills. His life was full, every hour accounted for, as though he knew the future was calling and he had no time to waste. At Piney Grove First Baptist Church, Red's voice rang out on Sunday mornings. Choir members often turned their heads when he sang, marveling at the depth of his tone for someone so young. He didn't just sing the words, one churchgoer later recalled. He believed them. To those who listened, it wasn't difficult to imagine him someday standing before crowds, not as a singer, but perhaps as the doctor he dreamed of becoming, offering comfort and healing. Because Red carried dreams bigger than the streets he grew up on. He talked about medicine with an almost sacred seriousness. He told friends he wanted to become a doctor, not just for the prestige, but to help people in his community, people like his grandmother, who worked tirelessly to keep him on the right path, or his mother who was trying to build a life for them between Florida and Alabama. Even in Junior ROTC, Red showed discipline and leadership that set him apart. In uniform, he stood taller, prouder. In drills, his instructors noticed he never quit, even when sweat poured and legs shook. That quiet resilience, that willingness to push forward, was part of who he was. And yet, for all his activity and ambition, Red was still just 16. He joked with friends, teased his cousins, played ball until dusk. He carried the ordinary worries of a teenager, grades, girls, the pressure of fitting in, alongside extraordinary hopes for the future. It was this blend, ordinary and extraordinary, that made his disappearance cut so deeply. When Red vanished, it wasn't just a boy who went missing. It was a son, a grandson, a teammate, a choir boy, a cadet, a dreamer. Those who loved him would forever see him not as a statistic, not as a name on a missing person flyer, but as the boy with the orange-tinged hair who believed he was destined to heal others. The boy whose absence would become a wound no medicine could cure. Morning light poured across Northwest 30th Terrace, the modest neighborhood alive with the hum of traffic and children heading to school. November 30th, 1983 began as a day so ordinary that no one could have imagined it would end in silence and unanswered questions. Maurice Jefferson, read to nearly everyone who knew him, woke in his grandmother's home, the place he often stayed when not in Alabama with his mother. The house was simple but filled with warmth, its walls carrying the faint smell of home-cooked meals and gospel music that often drifted from the radio. His grandmother, who had raised children of her own and now watched over her grandson, expected nothing unusual that morning. She remembered him leaving behind his wallet and identification on the dresser, a detail so small at the time it barely registered. After all, he was only going to basketball practice. For Red, it was routine, school, practice, the rhythm of a teenager's life. He pulled on his usual clothes, a white t-shirt, short beige pants, long socks, and white sneakers. Nothing suggested this would be the last outfit anyone would ever see him in. Neighbors spotted him heading down the street, his walk brisk, that familiar bow-legged stride carrying him toward Franklin Park. A few nodded or waved, recognizing the boy who often towered above his peers with his lanky frame and distinct red hair. In the neighborhood, he was known as polite, respectful, always moving quickly to his next activity. That afternoon was no different. At Dillard High School, the junior varsity team prepared for practice. The gym echoed with bouncing basketballs and laughter as players laced up their sneakers. Coaches expected Red, just as they did every day. He had talent, energy, and a determination that earned him a place on the team despite his lean frame. But as the minutes passed, his absence became noticeable. Teammates asked, "Where's Red? Did he get stuck at home?" At first, no one worried. Kids were late all the time. Meanwhile, at Franklin Park, some residents recalled seeing him, a tall boy in a white t-shirt, a brief moment in passing, then nothing. His trail dissolved into the noise of the city, the sound of cars, distant sirens, radios playing through open windows. By evening, the ordinariness of the day began to break apart. His grandmother sat waiting, expecting to hear his footsteps on the porch, the door creak open, his voice filling the room. But hours stretched long, and the house stayed quiet. She tried calling neighbors, asking if anyone had seen her grandson. The worry in her voice spread quickly through the block. At first it was dismissed. Maybe he stopped by a friend's house. Maybe he lost track of time, but as night fell and Maurice failed to return, dread crept in. A boy like him didn't just disappear. Not Red, who never left his belongings behind, who lived for basketball, choir, and the dreams he carried. To everyone else, November 30th was just another Wednesday in Fort Lauderdale. But for the Jefferson family, it became the dividing line. The last normal morning they would ever know, and the first night of a mystery that would haunt them for decades. Franklin Park was a familiar landmark for kids in Fort Lauderdale. Nestled between rows of modest houses and busy streets, it was a gathering spot for basketball games, laughter, and the chatter of teenagers who dreamed of brighter futures. On the afternoon of November 30th, 1983, Maurice "Red" Jefferson was seen there, perhaps pausing before heading to his team's practice at Dillard High School. It was a stop that would later take on an ominous weight. Several people in the neighborhood recalled glimpsing him at the courts. The image was unremarkable at the time: a tall, skinny teenager in a white t-shirt and beige shorts, sneakers squeaking against the pavement as he moved. Nothing seemed unusual. Franklin Park was a place he knew well, a place where kids came and went without a second thought. But for Red, this was the last confirmed location where he was ever seen alive and free. Two teenage girls later told police they had witnessed something disturbing: Maurice being forced into an Oldsmobile by two unidentified African-American men. Their account was chilling. Two strangers, a sudden struggle, and a car door slamming shut. The vehicle pulled away, leaving behind only silence. Yet their testimony was never fully confirmed. No physical evidence surfaced. No additional witnesses came forward with matching details. Was it real? Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or had they truly been the last people to see Red before he vanished? For investigators, that uncertainty became a heavy burden. For the community, it became the source of endless speculation. Some whispered that Red might have known the men, that it wasn't abduction, but something else. Others feared the worst, that he had been snatched away, another young life claimed by the violence of the streets. Meanwhile, at Dillard High School, teammates grew restless. Red's absence stretched into hours. Coaches assumed he might have skipped practice, though it was unlike him. His friends exchanged puzzled looks, unaware that at Franklin Park, something far more sinister may have already unfolded. Back on Northwest 30th Terrace, his grandmother waited by the window. Each passing car made her heart race. Maybe it was him. Maybe he was late. But the hours dragged on, and the front porch stayed empty. Franklin Park became, in hindsight, a symbol of that day's turning point. A public place in broad daylight where a boy could disappear without a trace. Families who lived nearby later admitted they struggled to walk past the courts without thinking of Red. What if they had looked closer? What if they had intervened? It was as though the ground itself had swallowed him. One moment, a boy chasing basketball dreams. The next, a ghost in his own community. From that day forward, Franklin Park would never feel the same. What should have been a safe space for teenagers became a haunting reminder. This was where Red's story fractured, where his presence was last captured in the memories of a few shaken witnesses, and where an entire city's unanswered questions began. The story of Maurice "Red" Jefferson's disappearance hinges on a fragile thread. Two teenage girls walking near Franklin Park that afternoon who claimed they saw something no one else did. Their testimony was simple but chilling. They said they noticed a commotion, a tall, lanky boy struggling against two men. The boy's bright hair caught the light, flashing orange under the Florida sun. They believed it was Red. The men were African American, strangers they didn't recognize, moving quickly, forcing him toward an Oldsmobile. Within seconds, the car door slammed. The vehicle pulled away, leaving behind the echo of tires on asphalt. It was the kind of detail investigators longed for: a possible last sighting, a description of suspects, even a car. But it was also the kind of detail that raised more questions than it answered. Were the girls certain? Could it have been someone else? Franklin Park was full of teenagers that day, and memories under stress often blur. Detectives tried to press for clarity, but no license plate was noted. No exact model or color firmly remembered. The Oldsmobile was a common car, blending into traffic like thousands of others on Florida's roads. Still, their words carried weight. If true, it meant Red hadn't simply wandered off. He hadn't decided to skip practice and hide out with friends. He had been taken, against his will, in broad daylight, in a public park, and no one else had intervened. The police report filed later reflected this tension. Some officers leaned toward the girl's story, believing it was the key to everything. Others doubted its accuracy, pointing out the lack of corroborating evidence. Without additional witnesses, without physical proof, the account sat in limbo, unable to move the investigation forward. For the Jefferson family, however, those words cut deep. The thought of Red being forced into a car, scared and fighting, was unbearable. His grandmother replayed it endlessly in her mind. Was he calling out? Did he look back toward the neighborhood, hoping someone would notice? His mother, far away in Alabama, clung to the idea that if people had seen him taken, then maybe someone knew where he went. Maybe he was still alive. Within the community, rumors spread quickly. Some whispered about kidnappings, about men who targeted teenagers. Others insisted the girls must have been mistaken. They wanted to believe Red had chosen his own path, maybe run away to chase bigger dreams. But those who knew him best rejected that theory outright. He hadn't taken money. He hadn't taken his identification. His whole life was still in that house on Northwest 30th Terrace. In the absence of certainty, the girl's testimony became both anchor and storm. It gave the family a picture of what might have happened, but it also left them tormented by questions with no answers. If Maurice was truly forced into that Oldsmobile, then someone, somewhere, knew exactly what became of him. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, no suspects were identified. No car was traced. The image of the Oldsmobile remained a phantom in the case file, a shadow of a clue, forever suspended between fact and doubt. As the sun set on November 30th, 1983, the Jefferson household on Northwest 30th Terrace grew restless. For most families, evening meant the clatter of plates at dinner, the television flickering in the background. But for Maurice's grandmother, it meant waiting by the window, scanning the street for the boy she called Red. She remembered the sound of his sneakers on the porch steps, the way he usually burst through the door with boundless energy. That night, the silence was deafening. Each minute passed like an hour. At first, she tried to dismiss her worry. Maybe practice had run late. Maybe he was hanging out with friends. But when darkness settled in and still no word came, fear gnawed at her chest. She began calling neighbors. "Have you seen Maurice? Did he stop by?" One by one, they answered no. Anxiety spread from house to house. Red wasn't the type to disappear. He had practice, responsibilities, dreams too big to throw away. Across state lines in Alabama, his mother had no idea that her son's life had veered into uncertainty. It would be hours before the news reached her, hours before her heart sank under the weight of dread no parent should ever carry. For years, she had split his upbringing with his grandmother, each doing their part to give Red stability. That arrangement, once practical, now felt like distance too great to bridge. By late evening, the family made the call to police. A missing teenager, a boy who had never come home. The grandmother's voice, shaking with urgency, described his red hair, his bow-legged walk, his clothes that afternoon. But the response she received was not what she expected. In 1983, police procedures often treated missing teenagers as runaways unless foul play was immediately evident. "Give it some time," the officer suggested. "He'll probably turn up." That answer felt like a slap. This wasn't just any teenager. This was Red. He hadn't taken money. He hadn't taken ID. He had vanished between one heartbeat and the next. Still, the official search would not begin for 3 long days. In the meantime, the family's own search began. Neighbors drove the streets, headlights sweeping alleys and parks. Coaches were called. Friends were questioned. The choir director at Piney Grove Baptist was asked if Maurice had stopped by. Every answer came back the same. No. That night stretched endlessly. The grandmother sat by the phone, praying it would ring. Each time it did, her breath caught, only to collapse into despair when it wasn't Maurice. She kept the porch light on, a beacon against the dark. The first hours of a disappearance are often the most critical. But for Maurice Jefferson, those hours were lost to doubt, to bureaucracy, to the cruel assumption that he would simply walk back through the door. By the time the seriousness of the situation was acknowledged, the trail had already begun to fade. For his family, those hours would become a haunting memory. The image of his empty room, the wallet and ID left behind on the dresser, the sense of something gone terribly wrong, and above all, the feeling that if someone, anyone, had acted sooner, Red might have been found before he slipped forever into the shadows. In the world of missing persons, time is everything. The first 24 hours can determine whether someone is found alive or lost forever. For the Jefferson family, those hours ticked by without urgency, swallowed by a system not built to act quickly for children like Maurice. When his grandmother reported him missing, the officers who took the call seemed unconvinced. 16-year-olds ran away all the time, they reasoned. Maybe he had an argument with friends. Maybe he decided to skip town. To them, Maurice Jefferson was just another teenager who would show up eventually. The words offered little comfort. Give it a few days. But those words cut like a blade. For a grandmother who knew every rhythm of her grandson's life, this wasn't rebellion. This wasn't teenage defiance. His wallet and identification were still in the house. His money untouched. His basketball gear waiting by the door. Everything pointed not to choice, but to something darker. Yet the official search didn't begin until 3 days later. By then, Franklin Park's basketball courts had long since been wiped clean by use. If there had been signs of a struggle, they were gone. The Oldsmobile, if it had ever been there, had melted into the endless stream of traffic. Witness memories so vivid on the day it happened began to blur with time. During those 3 days, the Jefferson family lived in torment. Red's grandmother barely ate, pacing from window to phone, each ring twisting her heart. She called hospitals, jails, anyone who might give her news. Nothing. His mother, hundreds of miles away in Alabama, made frantic arrangements to return to Florida, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Friends and teammates canvassed the neighborhood, their voices echoing, "Has anyone seen Red?" But in those critical hours, the silence was suffocating. Community members began to grow frustrated, even angry. At Piney Grove First Baptist Church, parishioners prayed but also questioned, why wasn't more being done? A choir boy had vanished. A son, a student, a cadet. Why wasn't the city moving heaven and earth to find him? When police finally opened an official case, it was already too late to capture the immediacy of the moment. They knocked on doors, interviewed neighbors, and questioned classmates. But instead of answers, they found only fragments. Yes, he'd been seen walking. Yes, he was at Franklin Park. Yes, 2 girls thought they saw something unusual. Nothing tied together. Nothing held weight in court. For the Jefferson family, those 3 days became an unhealed wound. Every anniversary, every retelling, carried the sting of what-ifs. What if officers had searched the park that very night? What if roadblocks had been set up when the Oldsmobile was first described? What if investigators had treated Red not as a runaway, but as a victim? Instead, the delay deepened the mystery. It gave his disappearance the air of something unsolvable, a puzzle missing its corner pieces. And as the case stalled, so too did the family's hope that answers would come quickly. Those 3 days lost to hesitation remain some of the most haunting in the story of Maurice Red Jefferson, a window of time when action might have changed everything. But instead, the trail grew cold. When news of Maurice Red Jefferson's disappearance began to spread, the ripple effects shook Fort Lauderdale to its core. What had begun as whispered worry on Northwest 30th Terrace soon echoed through churches, schools, and neighborhood streets. At Piney Grove First Baptist Church, the congregation gathered in uneasy silence. Red had been part of their choir, his voice carrying through Sunday services like a beacon of youthful hope. Now that same sanctuary echoed with prayer, the pews filled with bowed heads. "Lord, bring him home," members pleaded aloud. The choir director, who had once stood beside Red during rehearsals, could barely finish songs without his voice breaking. An empty space where Red should have stood was suddenly unbearable to look at. Dillard High School buzzed with confusion and dread. His teammates struggled to practice, the sound of bouncing basketballs now hollow, lacking the energy he once brought. Coaches reminded the boys to stay focused, but their eyes betrayed them. "He wouldn't just leave," one teammate insisted. "Not Red. He lived for this." In the locker room, his name lingered on their lips, each repetition sharpening the ache of absence. On the ROTC field, instructors noticed the same heaviness. Red had been a cadet with discipline and heart, someone who led by example even at 16. Now his uniform hung in a locker, untouched, a silent reminder of the boy who should have been there, marching in step with his peers. The neighborhood itself carried the weight of loss. Porch conversations turned to speculation. Was it really an Oldsmobile? Could it have been a mistake? Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers warned their sons to avoid walking alone. The once familiar streets seemed to twist into something threatening. Franklin Park, once filled with laughter, now felt haunted. Parents who once let their kids roam free began drawing them inside before dusk, casting wary glances at passing cars. For the Jefferson family, the community's concern was both comfort and torment. Neighbors brought food, offered rides, joined in the search. But every question, "Have you heard anything?" was another reminder that answers remained painfully out of reach. His grandmother, exhausted from sleepless nights, still sat by the window, the phone on the table within arm's reach, clinging to the hope that the next call would be Maurice. Rumors began to swirl as days stretched into weeks. Some whispered of gangs, others of strangers who prowled the streets looking for vulnerable kids. Some clung to the girl's story about the Oldsmobile, while skeptics dismissed it as teenage imagination. With so little evidence, truth and rumor became indistinguishable, feeding the unease that settled over the entire city. Yet amid the fear, there was also unity. Candlelight vigils flickered at Piney Grove, voices rising in hymns for Red's safe return. At school assemblies, teachers urged students to look out for one another. Posters bearing his face, his red hair unmistakable, were taped to telephone poles and shop windows. His nickname, once shouted across basketball courts, now appeared in headlines. "Where is Red?" Maurice Jefferson was no longer just a missing boy. He had become a symbol, a reminder of vulnerability, of the fragility of safety, of how quickly a life could vanish. For the community, his absence felt like a shadow stretching over every corner. And though people carried on with work and school, no one forgot. The streets of Fort Lauderdale had lost their sense of innocence. And for those who loved Red, every day without him was not just a mystery, it was a wound that refused to heal. In the weeks that followed Maurice, Red Jefferson's disappearance, detectives combed through every detail they could gather. But the more they searched, the more the case seemed to unravel into fragments that refused to fit together. The starting point was his grandmother's home. On the dresser sat his wallet, untouched. And inside were the few dollars he had, his identification card and scraps of notes from school. To investigators, this detail was telling. If Red had planned to run away, why leave behind money? Why leave behind proof of who he was? It made no sense. His clothing that day, a simple white t-shirt, beige shorts, long socks, and white sneakers, was ordinary, giving police nothing unique to track. No missing backpack, no bike abandoned along the road, just absence. The alleged Oldsmobile loomed large in the file, yet slippery. No one could pin down the color, no plate number, no clear description of the men said to have forced him inside. The two teenage girls' testimony was haunting, but without supporting witnesses, detectives could not verify it. Some neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual at all. Others admitted the park had been busy, filled with teenagers, cars passing by constantly. It was as if Red had simply dissolved into the background noise of an ordinary day. Phone records were checked, hospitals were called, jails across counties were contacted. No trace. Every lead dissolved as quickly as it appeared. Speculation filled the void. Some believed he had been targeted, maybe by people he knew, maybe by strangers. Others insisted he must have run away, chasing some secret dream. But friends rejected the runaway theory outright. His commitments were too strong. Basketball practice, choir rehearsals, ROTC drills. His dream of becoming a doctor wasn't something he would abandon in silence. Detectives even considered whether he could have been injured, perhaps fallen somewhere between the park and the school. Search teams swept the area, but no sign of him emerged. No shoes, no torn clothing, nothing. The lack of evidence left investigators paralyzed. Without a crime scene, without physical proof, without reliable leads, the case hovered in limbo. Each tip that came in led to another dead end. One caller swore they'd seen a boy matching Red's description at a gas station 2 towns over. Another claimed he was spotted hitchhiking along the interstate. Both leads went nowhere. For his family, every unconfirmed sighting brought waves of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. His grandmother would sit by the phone, praying each new call might bring her closer to the truth, only to hang up in tears. His mother, balancing life in Alabama, could barely endure the roller coaster, each rumor reopening wounds that refused to close. The absence of evidence became its own haunting presence. It was as if Maurice had been erased, every trace of his existence beyond Franklin Park scrubbed clean. Detectives privately admitted frustration. Without fresh leads, cases like this often went cold, and cold cases, once frozen, were almost impossible to revive. The community, too, was left in limbo. Posters faded in the sun. News coverage slowed. Conversations that once swirled around his name quieted into silence. But for those closest to Red, silence was unbearable. The fragments remained, the wallet on the dresser, the girl's story about an Oldsmobile, the whispers of sightings that never held up, pieces of a puzzle that never locked together. And as days turned into months, the image of Maurice Jefferson, the boy with the fiery hair and bow-legged stride, shifted from living memory into mystery. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Maurice "Red" Jefferson stopped being headline news. For many in Fort Lauderdale, life moved on. But for those who loved him, time did not heal. It only deepened the wound. In the modest home on Northwest 30th Terrace, his grandmother refused to change much of anything. The dresser where he had left his wallet and identification remained untouched. His shoes sat by the door as though he might step into them at any moment. She answered every phone call, even wrong numbers, with a flicker of hope before disappointment returned. At night, she sometimes sat on the porch, watching the street, convinced that one day Maurice's bow-legged stride would appear in the distance. Neighbors noticed her persistence. Some admired her faith, others pitied her refusal to accept what they feared was inevitable. But she would not let go. "As long as I live in this house, he knows where to find me," she told visitors. Decades later, she would still cling to that same address and the same phone number, a silent vow that if Red ever came back, he would know exactly where to go. His mother carried a different burden. From Alabama, she made countless trips back to Florida, each one stirring up grief. She often replayed their last conversations, wondering if she had missed a sign, a clue. She wrestled with guilt. Should she have kept him closer? Should she have insisted he stay in Alabama? The questions gnawed at her, with no answers to quiet them. For his friends, the absence of Red shaped their adolescence. On the basketball team, the empty space where he once played was never truly filled. His teammates graduated, moved on, but they often thought back to those practices and games, remembering the boy with the red hair and the easy laugh. At Piney Grove First Baptist Church, the choir felt incomplete. Songs that once soared with his voice now carried a hollow undertone. Even in Junior ROTC, instructors occasionally invoked his name, reminding cadets of the boy who had shown so much promise. Every milestone became a reminder of what Red had lost, and what his family had lost through him. When classmates walked across the stage at graduation, his absence was a shadow. When friends pursued careers, joined the military, or started families, they wondered what Maurice might have become. Would he have gone to medical school, just as he dreamed? Would he have returned to Fort Lauderdale as Dr. Jefferson, serving the community that raised him? Instead, the Jefferson family lived with a void that never closed. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays carried a bittersweet weight. His name was still spoken in prayers, but always with a catch in the throat, as though saying it too loudly might shatter fragile hope. Even decades later, the pain had not dulled. The unanswered questions lingered like a storm cloud. Where did he go? Who took him? Why? Without closure, grief never resolved into acceptance. It only hardened into something permanent, an ache that lived in the walls of his grandmother's home, in the pews of his church, in the memories of every friend who had once called out, "Hey, Red!" across the basketball court. The disappearance of Maurice Jefferson was not just a crime. It was a wound that bled across generations. And for his family, the worst part was not knowing whether he was gone forever or still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. Years slipped by, but the mystery of Maurice, Red Jefferson, refused to fade. For most missing persons cases, memories blur, attention wanes, and names vanish into dusty police files. But Red's disappearance clung to Fort Lauderdale like a shadow. Part of what kept the story alive was its ambiguity. Even official records could not agree on when he vanished. Some documents listed November 30th, 1983, the day his grandmother remembered him walking out the door. Others claimed it was November 28th, 2 days earlier. That small discrepancy gnawed at investigators, journalists, and family alike. If something as basic as the date was uncertain, how could the truth of what happened ever be fully known? For his grandmother, those details mattered less than the emptiness inside her home. Each passing year, she held on to the same address, the same phone number, the same hope. Holidays passed, birthdays came and went, yet she set a place in her heart for the boy who might one day walk back through her door. In the community, his name became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children not to wander far. Teachers invoked his story as a reminder of how quickly safety could vanish. At Franklin Park, whispers followed whenever teenagers gathered to play basketball. This is where Red was last seen. The court was no longer just asphalt and hoops. It was a silent memorial to a life interrupted. Decades later, in 2009, a glimmer of attention reignited. A documentary filmmaker announced plans to tell Red's story on screen. For the family, the news stirred complicated emotions. On one hand, they were grateful that someone wanted to shine a light on a case that had long gone cold. On the other, the thought of reliving their pain for cameras was almost unbearable. Yet the filmmaker's intent was clear. This was not just a missing person case. It was a human story, one that deserved to be remembered. Local journalists revisited the file, combing through old police notes, community testimonies, and the haunting claim of the two teenage girls who had seen the Oldsmobile. Their coverage rekindled public interest, sparking conversations across Fort Lauderdale. People who had grown up with Red now spoke as adults, reflecting on how his disappearance had shaped their own lives. One former teammate admitted, "Every time I see a tall kid with red-tinted hair, I think of him. I wonder if it could somehow be him, older, alive." Yet despite renewed attention, no new leads surfaced. The Oldsmobile remained a ghost. The suspects remained nameless. The fragments of evidence still refused to lock together. As the decades stretched on, Red's story became more than a mystery. It became a symbol of unanswered questions, a symbol of a community forever marked by the loss of one of its own, a symbol of how bureaucracy and delay can steal critical time in moments that matter most. For his family, the years did not soften the blow. Hope and grief lived side by side, tangled in the same breath. Some days brought the fragile belief that he might still be out there. Other days, the silence felt final. But whether Maurice Jefferson was alive or gone, one truth remained. His story still haunted the people of Fort Lauderdale. It was a reminder that some mysteries do not fade with time. They only grow heavier, pressing down on every memory, every unanswered prayer, every corner of the park where a boy once stood before he disappeared into history. More than 4 decades have passed since Maurice Red Jefferson left his grandmother's house and vanished into the Florida afternoon. Yet the silence surrounding his fate has never lifted. His disappearance remains a wound, not just for one family, but for an entire community that still whispers his name. Every story told about him circles back to the same images. A tall, bow-legged teenager with fiery hair, running across the basketball court, singing in the church choir, dreaming of medicine and healing. These memories float like fragments of a life that should have stretched forward, full of promise, but was instead cut off at 16. The unanswered questions linger like ghosts. Who were the men in the Oldsmobile? Did the girls truly see what they thought they saw? Could earlier action by police have made the difference? And most haunting of all, where is Red now? For his grandmother, the house on Northwest 30th Terrace became a shrine of sorts. She kept the same address, the same phone number, waiting for a call that never came. For his mother, the ache traveled with her, every milestone of her life shadowed by the absence of her son. For his friends, time moved on, but memories of the boy with the red hair never left. Cases like this often fade, replaced by newer headlines. But in Fort Lauderdale, the story of Red Jefferson remains a reminder of fragility, the fragility of safety, of trust, of life itself. It is a story without an ending, one that invites not closure, but reflection. Because every disappearance leaves two victims, the one who is gone and the ones left behind to wonder. As you listen to Maurice's story, perhaps you feel the weight of those unanswered questions too. Perhaps you see in him someone you once knew, a teammate, a classmate, a neighbor, a son. And perhaps you sense, as his family has for decades, that remembering him is the only way to keep his light alive. Maurice, Red Jefferson, may have disappeared in 1983, but his story has not. It lives on in the prayers of a grandmother, in the songs of a church, in the whispers of a community that never forgot. And tonight, it lives on with you. If this story moved you, if you believe stories like Red's deserve to be remembered and shared, we invite you to join us. Like this video, subscribe to our channel Touched by Grace, and help us shine light on the mysteries, the miracles, and the human stories that still echo through time. Because sometimes the greatest act of grace is to keep remembering, until the forgotten are forgotten no more. Maurice Red Jefferson's story remains unfinished. A mystery without answers, a wound without healing, but remembering him keeps his light alive. If this story touched you, please like this video, grace, and share it with others, so that Red's memory and the countless others like his are never forgotten.